Hello, Arizona, and thank you, First Things First, for inviting me to come today to speak about a prescription for play. As I think many of you know, First Things First and the many groups that you have in Arizona that help children are among the leaders in the nation and always have been. So it's a particular pleasure to be here for you. And of course, I can only be here virtually, and I apologize for that. But I was prevented from getting on a plane, so I'm just here to share our prescription for play. Let's start with a prescription for play, and many of you might have seen in the news how the prescription for play hit the news just last Monday, when we were encouraging pediatricians through our paper in Pediatrics to actually literally write prescriptions so that we can have more play in the daily lives of not only young children, but all children, and maybe as adults, we need it too. Now, why is it so important? Well, in the next slide, we give you an idea. Did you know that cats play? I guess you've seen that. And dogs play, monkeys play, and octopuses play? Well, that's incredible. I actually have seen videos of octopi using a Rubik's Cube. And on the next slide, we realize then that play might just be a biological imperative. Yet play, Dr. Ed Ziegler said, play is under siege in our current society. Whatever happened to play? Well, in the next slide, you see that in 1981, a typical child had 40% of her discretionary time for play. And by just 1997, that was down to 25% of her time. And you might ask, what about now? Well, we do have some data. First of all, we see it anecdotally. Recent research suggests that in the last 2 decades, children have lost 8 hours of free play per week. And 30,000 schools across the United States have dropped recess in the hope that we can get more time for real work. And maybe we understand it even better when we look at this gorgeous sign that came from courtesy of Tim Gill from the UK. Play to have fun, but no jumping, no running, no bouncing. No bad language and no vandalism. In the next slide, there's even newer findings that support the relative extinction of play. It was an Alliance for Childhood report in 2009. They did a survey of 142 New York classrooms and 112 classrooms in Los Angeles. Kindergarten classrooms, and what did they find? 25% of the teachers said that they had no time whatsoever for play in their classrooms. 61% of the New York teachers also reported having no choice time. Kids couldn't decide if they wanted to go to blocks or they wanted to go to puzzles. What was happening in the time that used to be devoted to play? Well, we know 79% of New York teachers reported that what was going on was test prep in kindergarten. Now, Daphne Bassick of the University of Virginia put out a report in 2016 to suggest that kindergarten has indeed become the new first grade. 80% of kindergarten teachers now say that their children should be reading. That is up 50% from just 10 years ago. Excuse me, the time for arts, down 16%. And here it is again. What about testing? Up 29%. And in its stead, in the next slide, you see that many young children are simply parked in front of screens. U.S. survey of over 1,500 parents suggests that 62% of 2 to 10-year-olds now have access to a dedicated e-reader. And parents are choosing from over 120,000 so-called, I can't even say it without the quotes, educational apps And what makes these apps educational? That somebody decided to call them educational. It's just an adjective. No one checks. In the UK, the data look much the same. In the next slide, you see that these issues and more prompted the American Academy of Pediatrics to write two separate reports. One in 2006 entitled The Importance of Play in Promoting Healthy Development and Maintaining Strong Parent-Child Bonds. They write, read it with me, these guidelines are written in response to the multiple forces challenging play. The overriding premise is that play is essential to cognitive, physical, social, and emotional well-being. In 2012, they were compelled to reaffirm that position, suggesting that play is essential to social, emotional, cognitive, and physical well-being of children beginning in early childhood, and teaching kids some of the important lessons they will need to be 21st century learners in a global society. And the next slide brings you to where we stood and stand as of next Monday. Spearheaded by my colleague, Dr. Michael Yogman at Harvard University, we released a new report that speaks to the cognitive and social advantages of play and talks about how play may even reduce stress for young children, especially for children living in underserved communities. He suggests strongly that the pediatricians hop on board and offer prescriptions for play. And so today, in the next slide, you see that I offer you a talk in three parts. First, I want to define play. I want to define free play and guided play. Then I want to talk to you about the real advantages of play, play in coping, play in social development, and play in cognitive and academic development. And then I want to throw it back to you to ask, what is our role? What can we do as home visitors, as teachers, as caregivers, as parents, to help out and to put play back in the lives of children? How now do we define play? On the next slide, you see that the standard definition of play is one about free play. And free play has been defined, whether with objects, fantasy, or make-believe, as something that's fun, that's active, that has no extrinsic goals, that's iterative, and that you keep doing it and doing it and doing it. If the tower falls, you just build it up again. That's meaningful, that's often, though not always, socially interactive, and that can contain, though it need not, an element of make-believe. We also distinguish in the next slide free play from what my lab and Roberta Gollenkoff's lab calls guided play. And in guided play, it's as if you are the coach rather than the director with a young child, but you do have a goal in mind, sort of like in a children's museum, where you build these marvelous exhibits and children have to navigate their way through the exhibits to optimize learning about something. But the adults really had a good idea about what they hoped each exhibit would yield. Here, guided play is defined as either setting up a wonderful environment through which the kids direct their play, and/or sitting on the sidelines as a coach, asking questions and building on what the child wants to learn. When we think about these different types of play, we can, in the next slide, talk about playful learning in what we call a 2x2. It's either initiated by a child or an adult, or it's directed by the child or an adult. Let's look at some of these examples. In the upper left-hand corner, we see something that is initiated by a child and directed by the child. The child wants to build a fort out of the couch pillows in the living room. And of course, in doing so, that child learns a little bit about the physics of the top piece of the fort and whether one of those cushions is just too heavy to build the roof. Going down on the bottom left, you see that child who has an idea, who wants to draw, wants to make something out of construction paper and decides he is going to build a circus. And here comes the happy adults who want to join in the play, and they suggest we really need a big tent. We really need lions and tigers and bears. And we could call that co-opted play. In the bottom right, we see learning that is initiated by an adult and directed by an adult, and we could call that direct instruction. And even if we make it fun, it's really still trying to put work in play clothes. In fact, one colleague, Hapgood, called it chocolate-covered broccoli. You can cover it with chocolate, but it's still broccoli. And the area that we're most interested in my lab is in the upper right. Initiated by an adult, the adult had an idea of what exhibit to build in that children's museum or what toys to have in that Montessori classroom. But the child directs the learning inside of that environment. That we call guided play. And another way to think about guided play is as a play spectrum. Let's think about multiple types of play. And in the multiple types of play, again, using initiated by and directed by, we can talk about free play anchoring one end, where the child is so in charge and the adult never talks about an extrinsic goal, or where the adult does have an extrinsic goal, but the child directs the learning and has agency. And gameplay, where again, the adult designed the game, but the kid is the one who plays within the game, all the way up to where it becomes non-play. And in non-play, the young children are really just in a direct instruction environment. In the next slide, we suggest that the research speaks to this, that play and playful learning of the sort that we just spoke of helps children in coping skills, in social regulation, knowing how to inhibit the responses, in language and literacy, in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and even, yes, even in critical thinking and in hypothesis testing. The next slide suggests that we have now seen several reports that came out recently suggesting that young children need to be taught in a playful pedagogy. Here you see a report from Deb Phillips in 2017 and some research by Bruce Fuller, also in 2017. I'll just read Bruce's. If you can combine creative play with rich language, formal conversations, and math concepts, that's more likely to yield the cognitive gains that they observed in their study. Yes, we want our children to be exposed to the richness of social skills and cognitive opportunities, but it can be delivered in a playful pedagogy. So in the next slide, we move you to the next part. What really are the advantages of play? Can they really help in coping? Can they really help in social learning? Can they really help in academic learning? In the next slide, we suggest they can. Play and coping. A review of the literature in 2006 involving pretend play in medical settings suggests that for inpatient and outpatient, pretend play can help mitigate pain, it can reduce that lashing out, externalizing behavior, and even help kids adapt to chronic illnesses. Further, play reduces stress. It has protective value for young children that improve their well-being and a reduction of anger, stress, and conflict. In the next slide, you see that play also helps with social regulation and the all-important, I'm sure you've heard this term, executive function skills, which is really kind of a jargon term which refers to memory, attention, impulse control, and flexibility. You all know those kids who just lash out when they want the swing, and Johnny is on that swing. How can they learn to wait? How can they learn to take turns? How can they learn to have self-guidance, planning, self-reliance, and socially responsible behavior? In the next slide, we show you that there are actually programs out there to help with this. One is called Tools of the Mind, and it's a key example of playful learning, developed by Deb Leong and Elena Bedrova. They came up with a series of fun activities that you can do in your classroom. You could do these at home as well to help kids learn these executive function skills. And what you see on the right is you see two girls who are reading a book together, and one has an ear and one gets the mouth. The one with the mouth can talk, the one with the ear can only listen. And then they swap halfway through. The results suggest that when children engage in playful learning throughout their school day on these very well-designed tasks, they get better executive function skills, and indeed they translate to better scores on standardized tests at the start of school. A woman, next slide, named Megan McClellan, who's a colleague of mine at the University of Oregon, has invented a series of classroom games. Again, you could use them at home or in the community for social regulation, and she gets similar results. One of them, give kids instruments and conduct the orchestra. Another is what she calls drum beats. You know when you play a circle game and you're all trying to hit the same beats? Those games, she suggests in her book, Stop, Think, and Act, help young children create executive function skills that they can later on use in the classroom. They make your classroom function just a little bit better. In the next slide, you see that this can also work for cognitive skills, academic skills, like literacy, telling stories in a fun way. I was playing with my 3-year-old the other day, and I started a story, and she then continued it, and I continued it from her. And we had the whole family chiming in to tell these stories. Wordplay, what rhymes with hat? Singing songs, ba, 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 baran. That's doing phonics. The dialogic reading, back and forth, where you go beyond the covers of the book. In the next slide, you see that we actually did some research on this that was funded by the Department of Education, where we read a book for young children, for 2 young children. Then we split the young children into 3 groups to master that vocabulary that we'd gone over in the books. Vocabulary like galloping and shield. In one group, they played with these plastic figurines and they could do anything they wanted, free play. In another, we were the adults who set up the structure and we helped them. We said, oh my, do you think that horse can gallop over and save the damsel in distress? And in a third group, we had the direct play, where we kind of told them exactly what to do. Now, it turns out that in the free play, they weren't getting any instruction at all, and so they didn't practice those vocabulary words as much. What would happen? In the next slide, you can see the results. And it turned out that the children in the guided play and in the directed play could use play to learn a number of those all-important vocabulary skills. And in more recent work that we present on the next slide, these are very preliminary findings, you will see that we added play activities like singing, large and small group games, drama, where they could act things out, and digital platforms. And the young children learned more vocabulary in our tasks than they had learned, than other children had learned in many other studies in the literature. Play kept their attention, kept their energy. They were engaged. It was meaningful to them. And so they learned more. In fact, in the next slide, we show you that we actually invented a game of chutes and ladders where they could practice that vocabulary. We compared it against what would happen if we had a really exciting, cool flashcard game. The answer? The kids learned much more when they were playing that chutes and ladders game than they did when they were just rehearsing it in a very fun way using flashcards. In the next slide, you could ask, what about STEM? Could children find patterns? And if they find these patterns, red, blue, blue, green, that one thing follows another predictably, could they make predictions? Could they learn the kind of patterns that were going to be so important in later mathematics? How about dividing candy and sharing it? Or if you don't like that, healthy food. sorting trail mix, playing I Spy with My Little Eye, a hexagon. Could those kids find the hexagon? Could they play with blocks? And can board games help? In fact, it turns out that there's research with board games that was done by Gita Ramani, who is at the University of Maryland. And when young kids roll that dice and they count along the number line to move the exact number of spaces, they're learning important concepts in early mathematics. Now, our study in the next slide was on block play. They were taking blocks out of the classrooms, and we wondered if block play would actually make a difference for young children's learning spatial language, like up, down, around, under, on top of. The red block is on the green block. The blue block is next to the green block. And the answer was, just put play with blocks in the home and in the school, and all of a sudden everybody's using spatial language. In fact, it turned out that you use a lot more, almost 10% spatial language when you have blocks than when you don't have blocks around. And are there certain play conditions that are better than others? Turns out guided play was the best. When you build the environment and you're the coach on the side, it turns out that children learn to use more of those spatial terms. In the next slide, we ask the critical question, well, why should we care if they use those spatial terms? Because spatial language relates to later spatial ability and later math ability. In research that we've done in the lab, we give children what we call the 2D and 3D TOSA test, the test of spatial ability. In the 2D, you see that they just have to copy a design. Put the triangle next to the circle. Put the blue triangle next to the pentagon. But notice they have to do more. Where do they put the pentagon next to that rectangle? Oh, it has to be in the upper portion, and it has to perfectly align. Can they copy that? And can they do it in both 2D and 3D? And what do we find? Those kids who at age 3 had these skills did better in mathematics when they entered the doorstep of school. One more study that I can't resist, another example in STEM on the next slide. We wondered if we could help children learn kitty geometry, the criterial features of a shape like a triangle. When you go home after this conference, check and you will see that almost all the books and all the things that you are using in the classroom talk about a triangle that has a point at the top. But we all know that triangles are more than just shapes with a point at the top. They are 3 sides and 3 angles. And when you have connected 3 sides and 3 angles, indeed, you have a triangle. In the next slide, I show you our 3 conditions. Oh, you could probably guess them by now. One was going to be a guided play condition where we throw a whole lot of triangles at the kid, and we say, wow, let's discover together the features of a triangle. In number 2, the direct instruction, we just say, did you know the triangles have 3 sides and 3 angles? And they just watched as the experimenter showed them the triangles that worked and the triangles that didn't. And in the exploratory free play, we just threw a whole lot of things at the kids, and they got to play in whichever way they wanted, with triangles and circles and hexagons and rectangles. Then, in the next slide, you see our shape sorting task. They were given 40 cards, and their job was to find the real shape. Could they only give the real triangles to Lilu the puppet, who only liked real triangles, not fake triangles? Which condition was going to do the best? Well, at this point, if I ask you to guess the real answer, the final answer, you probably can tell me. And in the next slide, you see the answer. They learned best in guided play. In guided play, they could even give you those atypical, weird, flopped on their side triangles and know that they were triangles nonetheless. The next slide is a kind of throw up just to show you that my colleague Sim and Ju from Berkeley have tried really complicated tasks where children have to learn that it's the blue rectangle is what you need in order to make a machine work. And then they have to learn that you can switch the strategies. And which kids can learn these fancy strategies? Well, you already know, the kids in guided play. And finally, in the next slide, I just want to show you a really cute slide. This is a toy that was constructed by Guan, Goodman, Spelke, and Schultz, and also used in the Alison Gopnik lab, where this toy has 3 different functions. Oh, one might be a button that you push and it rings a doorbell. Another might be if you move a piece of the button in a certain direction, a light goes on, or a weird sound will be made if you flick a switch. Now, in one condition, the kids are told, oh, push this button and a doorbell rings. And in another, the kids are given this toy and they're told to explore. What happens? Which kids learn all of the functions of the toy? Turns out that the kids who are told to press the button for the doorbell, they only learn about the doorbell, and they keep pressing and pressing and pressing. The kids who got to explore, those kids learned all the functions of the toy. Now, I should let you know that not all play is created equal, and in the next slide I show you that while there are many fabulous digital toys, for very young children, sometimes all the digital gadgets, gizmos, and language on the toys get in the way. 2 studies, one was by Sosa. Anna Sosa found that when you have parents playing with these electronic toys, they don't talk as much as they do when they're playing with traditional toys. And my colleague Jen Zosh, who's at Penn State Brandywine, has worked with us to study these electronic shape sorters. You put the shape in and it goes triangle, triangle, triangle. But it turns out the toy talks a lot, and guess who doesn't? The parents. So the language isn't as adaptive and the kids don't learn as much. Now you might be thinking, why should play work? And in the next slide, I suggest why playful learning could be so important. They're just hypotheses right now. But big idea 1 is, well, we know how children learn. They learn when they're active, engaged, when it's meaningful, when it's socially interactive. That's how humans learn best. And if that's how they learn best, then by gosh, play actually uses all these features. So if you teach and work in a situation where human brains work the best, then children will learn more. Hypothesis 2. Maybe guided play is like constrained tinkering. You know, if we put some boundaries on the play, as they do in a museum and in a Montessori classroom, then when the kids play, they're playing within a space where they're more likely to discover something than they are if it's free range. Big idea 3. We've been running some experiments, what we call mise en place. For those of you who studied developmental psychology, you probably heard about the giant in our field called Jerome Bruner. And one day I was lucky enough to have lunch with Jerry Bruner, and I said to him, I don't know, how is it that we can think about what play does for young children? And he said, it is a disposition for learning. It is a mise en place. It is a way of setting forth what you want the children to do in a fun and exciting way so that they are prepared to learn with joy. And the mise en place term comes from cooking, where you set up all the utensils and all the ingredients at the outset, and then it makes it just a lot easier to do the recipe you have in mind. Big idea 4. Well, maybe it's okay to be happy. Maybe joy and positive emotions help you learn so much better. And in the next slide, I suggest big idea 5. Maybe, just maybe, play allows you to build the suite of skills that employers tell us young children are going to need to be successful in a 21st century environment. Collaboration, how to get along, build community, work in teams. Communication, knowing how to speak, well, have strong language skills, and also to listen. We live in a Facebook society where we speak a lot more than we listen, and we think everybody cares what we had for breakfast. Content. We need to have content, and that is the centerpiece. But also includes learning to learn skills, critical thinking, creative innovation, and the last one, confidence. The confidence to know you can, the confidence to learn from failure, the confidence to have grit and stick to it while you're building that really tall tower out of blocks. And if you can, maybe you will succeed. And even if you fail, learn how to succeed the next time round. We call these the 6 C's. And on the next slide, you see that we try to sketch out and lay forth a way of thinking about learning with these suite of 6 C's in our book, Becoming Brilliant. And if you want to know about the science behind it, it's all explained there. All right, so maybe there is something to play, but how do we use it? In the next slide, we suggest that each one of us in this room can foster play by learning how to play better at home and play in the community. And now you're thinking, I don't have time to play at home. Parents don't have time to play at home. If they will give us just 2 minutes of their time, we can make a difference for all children in their lives through play. As you see in the next slide, one way to go about that is to encourage a prescription for play, that you actually make some time, even if it's only 2 minutes, to eke out a moment for play in your everyday. And the next slide, I point out that Alan Mendelsohn from NYU is actually trying to do that through his pediatrician office at NYU. He's helping parents learn how to play. And in his study, he's actually, with parents who come into his office, showing them videos of themselves and asking, what could we do to make this play richer? And he's gotten some absolutely beautiful results. In the next slide, I suggested those of you who are home visitors, those of you who are teachers could do the same techniques by helping parents learn how to play and having them see it for themselves. But you say, well, what toys would I use? In the next slide, I suggest that you might want to look at what Dr. Jane Aronson of Worldwide Orphans is doing. She has a whole collection of toys, and she shows you what you can learn from those toys. Imagine going in with these simple toys that you've all seen before, construction toys, art toys, and helping children and parents have conversations around those toys. Now, it turns out we can also put playful learning in our communities, the natural places where parents and children go. Did you know that even the children who are in full-time preschool are only there for 20% of their waking time? A question we're asking in our lab is, what can you do with the other 80% in the next slide you see? We created what we call playful learning landscapes. And it started with a simple question. When is a bench not a bench? What could we do with a simple bench to add playful learning so that young kids' minds could grow? And in the next slide, you see the first of our examples. We called it the ultimate block party. We started with 28 nuggets of science like the ones that I've shown you today. How can we create more spatial learning? And then we asked Lego, would you donate some bricks? So kids could rotate and build and do the very kinds of skills that you saw in the spatial block play I showed you earlier. Could we have cardboard boxes where children create costumes and do the dramatic play which increases vocabulary like I showed you earlier? Over 10 million people were reached in the Ultimate Block Party when we took over the band shell, Central Park, New York. We've done this in 4 other cities. You can do it in yours. Over 50,000 people came. And we even decided to do a handbook so that we showed where the science was and where people could glean new ideas for activities in their own hometown. Example 2. Move to the next slide and you see the supermarket study, a $60 study that was started in my honors class by a young woman who's now in graduate school and whose boyfriend was doing graphic arts. We asked, maybe we could put really cool signs in supermarkets. Maybe one would be a picture of a cow that says, hey, I'm a cow. I do milk. Can you find other things that might come from a cow? And they go through the supermarket and they play the game. We've only given them a prompt. We've now done this in laundromats as well. We've now replicated this, not just using simple signs, but using STEM signs. What can you count? And it turns out that when the signs are up, you get 33% more language between parents and children than when the signs are down. Moving on to next slide, urban thinkscape. In urban thinkscape, we were feeling emboldened. And we thought, well, maybe we can change bus stops. I mean, people go to bus stops. They wait at bus stops. What if bus stops had puzzles? Working with the community in Philadelphia, we not only took a small plot of land where Martin Luther King had given one of his Freedom March speeches in the 60s, and we designed science-inspired activities that would allow children to be learning and playing at the bus stop. The community members helped us with the design and even helped collect the data. Oh yes, we've now looked at hundreds of kids and compared it to what happens on a playground, a 28% increase. By the way, most interventions are jumping up and down at 10 to 15% increases in language interaction of kids and parents. In the next slide, you see our human-sized board game that we call Parkopolis. Here, we changed dice so that one was a fraction and one were whole numbers like the normal dice you see every day. And you marched along this game board and picked up cards that would help you with scientific reasoning and mathematics. Andres Bustamante was the student who helped on this. Now he is part of UC Irvine. And then the last example I will give you on the next slide. What could you do if you changed a library? This is a scene out of the Play and Learn Libraries, the Free Library of Philadelphia. I like to call it as a nickname, Playbrary, where we created a rock climbing wall. But the rock climbing wall has letters. And from the letters, you build words. And notice the cubby that we built right into the bookshelves. Here, children can not only find a nook for reading during the day, but at the end of the day, they can fill in with the seating that we used, which are puzzle pieces and tangram pieces that they can rearrange on the library floor while they're enjoying the library space. First results suggest that more people are using the library now and getting more information from play. You see in our next slide that together these projects, plus the work in the libraries and parks, form what we call learning landscapes. And in Philadelphia, we have a Philadelphia Playful Learning City where the whole city is trying to get into the act. And so we created a playbook so the community organizations writ large would know how to create these structures using science and architects. So what's the bottom line, you say? It may just be time to start writing prescriptions for play. I mean, after all, play helps us learn, play helps us cope, play helps us socialize. It's not the opposite of work. We learn via play, not work versus play. And so today, in the next slide, I challenge you. I challenge you to help Arizona's children and parents learn through play. I challenge Arizona to change the lens on the way they think about play and playful learning. I have to thank our funders and my longtime collaborator, Dr. Roberta Galenkoff, who's been with us every step of the way in designing these structures and testing us, and also invite all of you to go to some of our blogs and to follow us on Twitter, where we often put up the very latest stuff we find in the field so you too can be a part of the changing landscape on how children learn. Thank you so much for being an outstanding audience today. And again, I apologize for not being there in person, but I'm very much with you, and I can't wait to work with you to help Arizona's children.